Welcome to this exciting webinar. I'm incredibly looking forward to the conversation over the next couple of minutes. We published an exciting report a couple of days ago, and I can't wait to dive into some of its aspects today and discuss it with a great audience that we have on the webinar today. Before we get started, just a tiny bit of housekeeping here. FYI, this webinar is being recorded. We will hand out access to the recording after the webinar. We will have a Q&A session, so please submit your questions through Zoom. Maciek, who's on the call, will make sure that we get to answer as many of the questions as possible at the end. And then last but not least, if you do want to have some insights around AI security, this is something that we work on at Lakera, and so we're happy to book a one-on-one demo to have you speak with any of our AI security experts following this webinar. A couple of words about myself. My name is David. I'm incredibly fortunate to host this webinar today. I'm also the CEO and co-founder of Lakera. And prior to Lakera, I spent about 10 years building some exciting AI applications across finance, healthcare, and aerospace, and then decided to start Lakera to help enterprises with the GenAI adoption, probably the biggest transformation of our lifetime. And so we are very excited to be right in the middle of that and working with some incredible companies. Those companies are across finance, technology, and other sectors to really help them sort of get their GenAI adoption right from the get-go. It's still early days in many ways, but we like to partner with companies early to address their needs from literally day zero. And as part of this, we have built an amazing security solution that uses AI to secure AI. Lakera's AI application firewall is continuously evolving hour by hour during this webinar. And it really thrives on the threat intelligence that we've put together with insights from real GenAI applications, our research team, and also Gandalf. Many of you are familiar with Gandalf, I'm sure. I often say it's not only the largest, but it's also the most fun red team in the world. We've had over 1 million people on the platform. And I recommend, maybe not in the next couple of minutes, but after this webinar, follow the link here on the right. Gandalf.lakera.ai. We just released a fun set of new levels that really sort of require you to take your prompting skills to the next level. I tried it a couple of days ago. Incredibly fun, and recommend it to everyone else. So with that, I want to turn to our audience. Again, some incredible people on this call. First and foremost, Joe Sullivan. Joe, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself. I saw you a couple of weeks ago at Black Hat, which is great. And incredible to have you back on this webinar here.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's great to see everybody from all over the world joining. I think it's a really important conversation and topic. And yeah, my background, I've been in cybersecurity since the 1990s. When I got out of school, I started out as a federal prosecutor. I was really the first federal prosecutor in the United States who was doing cybercrime cases, trying to figure it out, kind of the way we're trying to figure out AI security right now. It's early days, and it's a fun time to be part of it. And then I got to go be the CSO at Facebook, then Uber, and then Cloudflare until 2022. And I've been doing outside consulting and advising. So I spent a lot of time going inside corporations of different sizes and helping them think through some of the issues like we're talking about today.
Amazing. Thank you, Joe. You actually published an amazing article just a couple of days ago that I know has become very popular on social media. AI has just become interesting and exciting, I would say, where you go into some of your perspectives and insights from talking to leaders in the space over the last couple of months. So the link is in the article. Recommend checking it out. Yeah, really great article. Christina, over to you. I know you're doing a lot of incredible work with the Atlas MITRE sort of initiative. Please, if you could share a couple of words, that'd be fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Really excited to talk with everyone on the panel and hear from the audience today. As David said, I lead MITRE Atlas, which is our large community collaborative effort and a framework that really helps to characterize these tactics and techniques that adversaries are using to take advantage of the vulnerabilities in our AI-enabled systems. Those of you coming from the cyber world like Joe might have heard of MITRE ATT&CK. Atlas is built directly off of it, right? So this is very much designed to especially help the cyber community quickly come up to speed on these new tactics and techniques. And those of you that aren't familiar with MITRE, we're a not-for-profit that kind of works at the intersection of a large community of government and industry partners as we're trying to kind of solve some of these larger problems that are facing our society, especially in science and tech in general. So really excited to get to talk with everyone today about some of the different things that you all can get involved in as we continue to kind of build out the AI security space.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm speaking to lots of companies adopting GenAI right now. I just know what kind of valuable resource you're putting together there. Lots of people are looking to your work, and so it's great to have your perspectives on this webinar as well. And then last but not least, David, you're doing a lot of incredible work at Scale AI. Over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you all the panelists. It's super exciting to be here. I have nearly 20 years of experience in tech startups, mostly in platform engineering. I got into cybersecurity about 10-ish years ago. For the last year and a couple of months now, I've had a really interesting opportunity. We built one of the largest generative AI red teaming platforms for DEF CON last year. As David said, Lakera has probably beat us out as not being the largest anymore. But that platform was really successful. We had a lot of fun with it. The White House ended up writing about us. It was such a good time to partner with all the major frontier models. Then we ended up taking that platform to Congress. So we were on Capitol Hill, and we got to sit down with some of the legislators in the House and the Senate to demonstrate what AI red teaming is and what it looks like and how these systems are vulnerable. And I think that was really exciting. Since then, we've worked with a lot of NGOs and institutions, UKASI, and other organizations. So I'm super excited to be here, and I'm really stoked about generative AI and red teaming. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And that's our webinar. Some are trying to look into your article, Joe. I'm not sure we've shared the right link there, so Maciek will see if we can fix that imminently. But maybe Joe, to start off, while people are trying to get up the article or read it afterwards, can you just give us a quick TLDR of sort of what are your insights there? Why did you decide to write this article?
Yeah, a lot of the articles I write come out of the experiences I have spending time with security leaders. A lot of my work is mentoring the next generation of security leaders, and I would say like a year ago, last summer when we went to security conferences, people were talking about, and executives were very worried about what's happening with AI security. But my team, we're not investing enough. What should we be investing in? What are the big problems? And so it was all very kind of anxiety-driven theoretical conversations and not substantive real. And there's something about security people. It's like when you deal with real threats, it's kind of like, I don't want to say you live for it, but you kind of do. You're like, okay, this is real. It's not practice anymore. And that's what it felt like this summer at the security conferences, this spring at RSA, and it feels like now when I have a conversation, 3 or 4 security execs come together, CISOs or CSOs or CISOs, whatever you call yourself, and they would come together and they'd be like, oh my God, you won't believe what happened. And they start telling the story and then how they dealt with it. And they're like, we got to get out of reactive mode and be more proactive. And that's basically the evolution that's happened in the last year. Like the problems have become real, which means the work is real. And it's kind of more motivating and invigorating and scary.
I couldn't agree more, and so we share a lot of that perspective. Maybe over to you, Christina and David. How far have we come on the AI security front? Like how much have we gone from sort of theory to practice? What are some of the stories or sort of insights that you hear from sort of your both of your backgrounds and sort of the work that you're doing?
David, I'd say it's actually very encouraging to see how much the community has grown in developing tools, capabilities, knowledge around the AI security landscape over the last 5 years, and even longer than that. But like over the past 5 years, especially, we first started building out Atlas with a big community of industry collaborators and government collaborators about 5 years ago, and just seeing how many additional tactics and techniques we've seen adversaries demonstrate, right? Like the rise in sophistication of adversaries has also grown a lot over the last 5 years. So I think we've definitely had to continue to build up as a community our tools and knowledge and expertise to be able to deal with these continually evolving threats, because it's going to get even more complex over time. But just watching the number of startups like yourself, right? Like, and the number of kind of knowledgeable community members that are deliberately focusing on this space has significantly grown over the last 5 years. And I'm very encouraged for how we might be able to continue to take advantage of this proactive window before adversaries are, we're seeing kind of repeat attacks of things like the worm attacks, right? On the cyber side, like 20, 30 years ago, right? Definitely we haven't experienced some of these like massive world attention grabbing type attacks, definitely major things that I can talk through later on in the panel discussion, but nothing quite that big yet. So I think we still have a little bit of a proactive window to continue building out expertise and community capabilities to deal with these more over time.
Love that. I love the proactive window that we have, potentially in front of us. David, from your perspective, how much time have we got, or do we have any time at all?
Yeah, I want to build on top of what Joe and Christina said. I think it's a very interesting time. This is probably the most explosive tech experience that I've been through in my 20 years of experience in cutting edge technology companies. It's really interesting to me. I think the biggest shocker to me is the barrier of entry. It's really easy now for like phishing campaigns to come up with these beautifully well-written emails. One of the easiest ways to detect if something was phishing is looking for typos, looking for things like that. With the use of LLMs, I think these kind of standard attacks are going to be really, really impactful over the next coming years or months, even in that case. I think we're just at the very beginning of this. I think we're going to start finding tons of different vulnerabilities like RAG to exfiltration. I think it's going to be a really big one. And that one really scares me. I don't think we have a solid understanding of how the RBAC system is actually going to work in LLMs. And so this just creates a large surface area for us to be impacted by. And I think it's very exciting to be working on these kind of things right now, because, these massive problems are super exciting to dive into and figure out, understand, and then try to solve. But yeah, I think it's happening faster than any of us could imagine. And I think it's scary in a good way. It's exciting to be able to come in and start finding where all these vulnerabilities are, how they work, how these LLMs are actually starting to think, and how they're not exposing what they're thinking, but how we can use prompt engineering techniques to kind of figure out the underlying experience the model is telling us, so we could really start to find those and discover those and start patching them up and making the world of cybersecurity better.
I always think about like what has actually changed with GenAI, and I think it's interesting to really sort of think about what the transformation that technologies like ChatGPT bring. And at the end, one is certainly what you just mentioned, David. It's so accessible. Everyone can use it, play with it, but also everyone can tamper with that technology. Like today, you literally need to speak English to be able to hack, and that certainly sort of changes the playing field. One thing that we've done a couple of weeks ago is we've published our GenAI security readiness report, which was also the trigger for this webinar, and to bring all of us together here. The report is available at aisecurity.report. We've had over 1,000 respondents, which certainly speaks to you, Christina, what you mentioned around sort of the growing community and the growing interest. When Maciek and other team members and I started working on this, we didn't really expect that much sort of influx and contributions to this report. We've had world-leading organizations contribute to this, from Scale, David, to Atlas, Mitra, Christina, to a whole lot of hundreds of other organizations. And I think the most exciting bit about this report is to really see the energy around this work and the contributions that people have made. In this report, we have the largest fraction of sort of contributions comes from cybersecurity professionals, CISOs, and security analysts, practitioners. But we've also heard from developers and business users, people that are building the application, people that are trying to put these applications into practice, to hear about their concerns as it relates to AI security. a lot of people that contributed have significant experience in the field. Over 5 years of experience, that's the majority of people. So they've seen a thing or two as it relates to security, but often also find it challenging, of course, to deal with this rapidly changing landscape here. I guess where I want to start off is to look at some of these headline numbers that we sort of put together from the report. If we look at the data that we got out of this, all of the contributions, 90% of organizations are actively implementing or exploring LLM use cases. But at the same time, 5% feel confident, and I should say only 5% feel confident in their sort of AI security implementation / preparedness. And then a third number here is around AI specific threat modeling, where a fraction of the people that we ask are actually sort of doing this as part of their GenAI efforts. So I guess what I wanted to start off with is a quick conversation with you, Joe, Christina, and David around, are these numbers surprising? Like we asked, over 1,000 people, is this what you would have expected? Is this surprising? Any thoughts on these headline numbers before we dive into that?
I'll jump in. I'm not surprised at all. What I'm seeing inside organizations is a little bit confusion about who's responsible for AI security, especially when you layer in, some people thinking about AI safety as opposed to security. So the content moderation side, the user experience stuff. A lot of security organizations inside enterprises aren't used to thinking about the product experience, the end user experience outside of their own employees. And so many of the AI deployments are customer facing. And so the security teams they're comfortable stepping up and saying, oh, it's my job if it's a data security thing. I got to lock down the inside stuff. I've been doing that forever. That's what I do. And they'll say, okay, if it's an application security issue where there's a vulnerability in code, that's kind of been in our job too. But then this content moderation, all the kind of new things make security organizations look at it and say, like, well, who on our team's job is that? That kind of falls outside of our traditional scope. And like one of the questions that I ask every company is like, where are you putting your AI security work? And sometimes it's closer to the product team than it is the security team. So I don't think it's actually fully settled whose job it is in every organization. But the good news is at the high level, the boards, they're pushing the companies to adopt, but they're also worried about the risks. And so a lot of security leaders are realizing if I want to get budget, I should go do this work because the board will give it to me.
I'd say the other thing too is how you actually understand if you were vulnerable to these AI security vulnerabilities. It's not just like a single check and you're done kind of problem either, right? And that's part of the fundamental shift, especially for the security organizations that are starting to deal with this. Like Joe's spot on, right? Like a lot of people are struggling with whose problem this is to begin with, but even beyond that, the fundamental change in how you assess this risk over time and the fact that you have to, right? Because these systems are constantly bringing in new data, they're changing over time, right? And even then your use case and the type of risks that you might have a tolerance towards are evolving over time. So there's a pretty significant shift in even the traditional cyber world, right? Like you can't just, deploy a patch and say, I'm protected against X, or look at a system once and say, okay, it's good to go. You have to kind of evolve this to be a full life cycle, continuous evaluation and risk discussion around using an AI-enabled system now that is kind of fundamentally breaking some of these traditional security models. And that's been a really interesting thing for us to try to help the broader community figure out, especially as even the language around this space continues to evolve, because I think that's the other thing that the community is really still struggling with, right? Like how we describe these problems in a standardized way. Or even, if we using the same words to mean the same thing, right? Because many folks are kind of blending this world from the traditional cyber landscape to now these AI development organizations. They might be using the same words, but meaning two totally different things, which is helping to slow down the overall progress in general.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by 90% of organizations are actively, expecting to use LLMs. I think it's not necessarily just this case of a brand new technology coming out like has happened for the past 30 years, but I think this is really changing the entire world. Like we're never going to go back for sure. I do. I am a little sus about the 5%. That actually surprised me. I thought it would be less. I think highly confident in AI security preparedness is really, that seems really high to me simply because nobody quite understands it yet. Like a lot of companies that we've been working with or talking to are like, sure, AI security is super important. What is it? Explain it to us. Like we don't understand. I think what I found, at least while doing this, is it was really interesting that like data exfil is obviously there. A lot of the historical security vulnerabilities are still there. But I think what LLMs really exposed and have bubbled up is the risk of reputation. I think it's happened a lot. We saw it with Gemini. We've seen it with, there's a Chevrolet dealership that sold a truck for $1. Like there's financial loss there, but there's also just risk of reputation, which I think is really, really interesting and maybe a new threat vector. Reputation's always been a risk that security has to account for. But I think now it's increasing that quite a bit. And yeah, I think the 22% of organizations doing threat modeling is also really exciting. That's super encouraging to me to see people starting to adopt this, starting to understand the test and evaluation of your models is super important to really understand the threat landscape. We're not there yet, but it's really encouraging to see people continuing to build that.
I think the one thing about that 22% number that gives me the most pause is, what are you basing the threat modeling off of? Because I'd say that's one of the biggest struggles that a lot of the community that we've heard from is working here right now, right? Like in most cases, they have access to their own data, right? Of how AI-enabled systems are being attacked. Or maybe if they're red teaming their own systems, that's what they have access to. But there's not like a lot of visibility at scale to be able to inform that kind of data-driven risk analysis around the threats here. So that's been one of the biggest spaces that we've been focusing on with our kind of larger community group of like 150 organizations around Atlas to try to kind of enable more of that, because I don't think we're going to be able to really model the threats at scale here or really prioritize which ones we need to be focusing on the most until we get outside of our organizational silos, that kind of like small view on what the threat landscape looks like right now.
I love that. And Christina, when you're doing your work sort of around the threat landscape for GenAI, and we're looking at this number of 90% are somewhat working with LLM use cases. Like from your perspective, like what are the use case, like types of use cases that you're, I guess, working around, most concerned about from a security, from a threat perspective? Is there any sort of group of use case types that you're most concerned about that you see people working on right now?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift in kind of risk posture happens when you're starting to implement some of these systems in a higher consequential environment, right? And when I'm saying that, I mean like there's a difference in level of risk when you're dealing with human life or sensitive data or something that has legal restrictions around it, for example, instead of something that is making a movie recommendation or is helping you draw a picture or something, right? Like there's a very, very different risk tolerance. So now that we're starting to see AI-enabled systems start to get integrated into more high consequence environments, or us start to kind of explore that kind of impact, right? Because that's ultimately the positive side of this. These systems can have a very positive impact on really high consequence environments, but the risk tolerance is very different in that space. So we're trying to kind of deliberately help the community develop these tools and techniques for dealing with that risk over time, like I talked about earlier, especially as you're using these systems in healthcare environments, right? Or to look at human data, or even just like handwriting samples, right? Like when people are filing paperwork that will ultimately impact their life in a positive way or in a particular way. That's something that we need to be very careful about, making sure that we're limiting the risk for some of these systems to be having in kind of the overall environment, and limiting the potential like privacy and security leak problems that you can have around some of these systems being incorporated in honestly fairly naive ways, which is one of the bigger challenges that we're seeing as folks are just starting to bring them in and incorporate them.
Yeah. And then David, I mean, you get to work with lots of incredible people in the community. Like what are some of the use cases that you're seeing? Where are people, and what makes you sort of lose sleep at night?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Christine on the fact that regulated environments are going to be a real problem. Honestly, it's gonna take a lot of thought into making them very secure. I think on the other hand, I think agentic systems are going to be really interesting to start understanding and start red teaming and start trying to break and start trying to figure out where those threat vectors really are and where the fault tolerance is. I think when you start having a model that's now instructing other models to do work on your behalf, really interesting and truly bad things could happen. You start prompt injecting the model, the maintaining model, and it starts then prompts inject some of the underlying agentic models. I think it really adds a very interesting landscape, and it's an exciting uphill battle to be in, but it's definitely something we need to start thinking about and start testing and researching a lot more.
Yeah, David, you said something a while ago about how Gandalf changes when the underlying LLM updates, and how like somebody who went through Gandalf, and like the success rate that might go up when a new backend LLM is put in place, and it just. I remember the first time you said that, it blew my mind. Like, well, like the security team, they did all the testing and they thought it was done. And then now they have to think about every update to the LLM is basically like, we're starting over again. And that's not easy. You're muted.
I'm glad you remember that conversation, Joe, because it's certainly one of the interesting insights that we got out of Gandalf and are still getting out of it. So for some context here, lots of Gandalf runs GPT models under the hood, and one thing we found is that as OpenAI rolls out updates to their models, the behavior of Gandalf changes quite dramatically, and there's actually a bit of a phase transition that we see over time. I spoke about that at Black Hat and RSA this year, where sort of some of the hacking techniques they would still apply sort of after the update, but some don't, and people have to get creative again and sort of find new vulnerabilities that they can exploit. So some fascinating data that's coming out of that. David, you spoke about the 5% is surprising. It seems quite high. Yet at the same time, 95% of people that are sort of contributing to this, they feel not confident. Have sort of medium to low confidence in their security controls. Like, why is that? And David, maybe to start off with you, what are some of the underlying reasons that let sort of traditional security struggle here in many ways?
Yeah, sure. Machine learning has been around for just as long as cybersecurity has. It's been here quite a while. I think with the explosion of large language models, and specifically ChatGPT a couple of years ago, I think it caught people off guard in ways that they weren't expecting. I think the output of a model just seems so powerful and so exciting. And I think the security community took a beat to actually understand that this isn't a fad. This isn't going to go away. This will be here forever. And like most people in cybersecurity and blue teaming, like you are sometimes a step behind. And I think that's unfortunately where a lot of organizations are at right now. They're one step behind. I think because there's a lack of understanding. There's a lack of understanding your threat landscape. There's a lack of understanding how these systems even work. I've given a few talks on this, but I've noticed a lot of people don't even understand that it's just a web application. You're still going to have vulnerabilities, like traditional security, cybersecurity vulnerabilities there. So I'm not surprised that it's a low number right now. I think as this community matures and as LLMs mature, that number is going to skyrocket significantly, and I think it's going to happen pretty quickly. But we're still in the very beginning stages. This is the wild west of the internet is now here with LLMs.
I want to talk a bit more about sort of the specific threats that we are seeing and sort of why this is such a hard problem. But I want to put that sort of on the back burner for just a second and just quickly touch on the threat modeling here. Christina, you already mentioned it's encouraging to see people sort of adopting AI specific threat modeling. Talk us quickly through maybe some of the challenges that you see in sort of threat modeling as it relates to AI specific applications, GenAI applications versus what we've done sort of over the last 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, definitely some of the newer ways that these systems can be taken advantage of, both from an infrastructure standpoint and from kind of the things that are inherent to an AI-enabled system, is something that's continuing to come up, right, as folks are finding more and more creative ways to break these things. So Atlas and like the tactics and techniques in it are continuing to evolve on a pretty regular basis, right? As folks continue to report case studies on new ways that these systems can be attacked. And I would say that over the last 5 years of us kind of building the framework out, the last 2 of kind of the LLM landscape explosion has led to the fastest evolution of those tactics and techniques, as folks were talking about earlier. So some of the kind of things that we deliberately try to focus on when we are capturing those new tactics and techniques is some of the real world examples of how these systems have been attacked in the wild. And like some of those have really big numbers associated with them. Like there was a facial recognition system from the Shanghai Tax Authority that was taken advantage of by 2 individuals, and they stole $77 million from the Shanghai Tax Authority over a 2.5-year period by repeatedly executing a very simple kind of attack using some headshots of Chinese citizens that they presented to the facial recognition system over and over again. Right. But those kinds of, attacks directly on the model are continually happening in new and creative ways. And we try to capture those fairly unique examples to characterize these new tactics and techniques in the matrix on that public facing website. And then there's kind of newer ways that folks are taking advantage of the just infrastructure or naive integration of some of these systems, like Math GPT, when these LLMs first started to kind of take the imagination of the especially science and tech community. They implemented an implementation of one of these models on a public-facing website that was designed to help folks solve math problems, and they just connected it directly to Python on the back end that was actually, running some of these calculations, and didn't really implement a lot of guardrails or safety precautions in the middle there. So folks were able to quickly get access to their API key, right, of some of the initialization instructions, and ask the system to compute forever, right? Like, tell me pi, right? Like do something that is going to compete forever. And it ended up looking a little bit more like a traditional denial of service attack that brought their server down for a couple of days, right? So some of the kind of naive implementations, and even now some of the newer ways that the infrastructure itself can be vulnerable, like for those of you that aren't familiar with it, the shadow ray vulnerability, if you just look up shadow ray, that's an actually Atlas case study in progress right now that starts to show a little bit of some of the AI-specific infrastructure vulnerabilities that are currently pervasive across a lot of implementations of systems that, and that particular vulnerability hasn't even been mitigated yet, right? So I'd say the threat landscape itself is evolving pretty rapidly here, and that's if we're just kind of staying zoomed in on the security and assurance of these AI-enabled systems. When you start to think about the ways that these systems can be misused, or using AI for kind of the more traditional cyber landscape, that's a totally different problem and even bigger outside of this.
Yeah, and I love that's the perfect segue onto sort of our next set of findings here. We asked people what kind of like GenAI risks they are most concerned about. Like what are the most common risks that they think about? What are the most common concerns? And we sort of picked the top 5 here. From biased output to data leakage, the misuse of AI outputs. We already talked about model manipulation. I always think that gets very interesting when we start to think about agents interacting with each other, and then also unauthorized access as sort of one of the topics here. Christina, you think a lot about the different threats out there, and how to make sense of them, how to categorize them. What is sort of the most common concern that you discuss, you hear about in your circle?
Yeah, a lot of folks are especially worried about the new vulnerabilities that are specific to LLMs. I mentioned earlier that one of the biggest evolutions of the Atlas matrix has been in this LLM landscape. We did our biggest launch of updated tactics and techniques and addition of those unique case studies to the Atlas website a little over a year ago with the community to kind of start to better characterize those. But even since then, like the Morris 2 worm attack, right? Like that's just kind of the propagating prompt injection type attack, and some of the additional ways that you can start to take advantage of LLM and GenAI deployments and type systems in particular, that's continuing to evolve pretty rapidly right now. And I really don't think the community has a lot of solutions to these problems, for like the landscape as a whole, right? For example, like data poisoning for a large language model or a GenAI enabled system can be quite challenging to detect. And some folks have even like downloaded models from Hugging Face or other repositories and deliberately changed a few of the weights to poison the output of the model, and then re-uploaded them and exposed them to the public again. And you really can't measure or detect that they did that. So There's definitely a large range of problems that we don't even have solutions for yet, but just continually to staying on top and better characterizing those risks, and then understanding those risks against your use case, your specific AI enabled system in its kind of operational environment is where we're trying to encourage folks to focus right now.
Joe, you talked to a lot of CISOs and leaders in the field. How do they think about these new threats and sort of, what's like what do people discuss at the dinner table, and what are they concerned about as it relates to what we see on the slide here?
So I do think that they still tend to not focus as much on, like I said earlier, the things like the biased output, the content moderation stuff, even though it shows up here, because I think you're engaging with people who are really practitioners or passionate. Like the people on this call are people who are passionate about it, are thinking about it all the time, are excited about it. And this typical security leader has 100 other problems that they're stressing about at the same time. And the thing I worry about the most for them is they tend to think that, oh, I already have a DLP solution. So, okay, I'm just going to put my traditional DLP product in front of my employee as they access the chatbot or whatever. And they think that their traditional tools are hopefully going to help them. Or they have an overconfidence in their role-based access control that exists. I've been inside 100 organizations in the last, I don't know, a couple of years, and it feels like every single one of them thinks that they have better access controls than the reality. And to me, like the concept of role-based access control and least privilege are probably the least invested in and least, like, we should have less confidence in those internal controls than just about any other existing internal controls. And this world of Gen AI is about to just blow that all open and show that to the whole world. And I think they should be more scared of it than they are.
Yeah, in line with blowing it all open, David, you talked about agents before. Most people today, most of the respondents here, they're looking at conversational AI. Think of a chatbot, but agents are around the corner. We certainly have companies that we're working with. They're exploring how agents can permeate their organizations. How is what we see here going to change in the world of agents? How are GenAI risks going to change? I guess one of them is scale, but is there anything fundamental that we have to sort of change in our thinking around GenAI risks once these agents hit production at scale?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we really need to understand what that handoff between models looks like. I think there is just a significant lack of visibility between what the user input, the prompt is, and then as that gets decided upon which agent it's going to, and then how is that information being passed on to the agent. So when I ask, the conversational chatbot a question, it then processes it to decide which agentic model needs to handle it, and then it hands it off to that. I think in the case of the bias output, it's really interesting. I just talked to somebody recently who does compliance documents for banks, for small banks. And they actually had an interesting use case for bias output that I haven't thought about, where in their RAG database, they had 2 documents and one was out of date. The teller asked a question, it went into the RAG database and pulled back both answers, but the bias and the weight was on the older document. And so when the teller told one of the customers, here's what our compliance story looks like, it actually kind of really sent that CEO like a pause. Like, it was really interesting to see how easy it is to mess up in this landscape. And I think a lot of it just comes down to visibility. We're not sure what it looks like when you're having these conversations with the models and it spreads out. There are tools, there are ways to do it. It's just not being implemented yet. And so I think a lot of these threat landscapes are going to continue to expand and grow in unique and interesting ways that maybe we haven't even thought about yet, which is it's an intense thought to think about, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's one line of thought here, or types of activities that we are seeing in that there's new stuff coming out every single day. New vulnerabilities, new types of exploits, different sort of use cases that people are integrating GenAI into, and with that sort of creating new risks for their organizations. At the same time, we also get to speak to organizations and individuals that do claim their traditional security measures sort of do the job, or they bring a simple sort of rule-based whatever model checking into the game. Or actually one of my favorite solutions here is we use sort of ChatGPT to protect ChatGPT. Well, what we find out sort of time after time is that none of these things actually work. So I just wanted to drill down just for another minute, like what's different here? Is it the accessibility? Is it the interfaces? Is it the fact that we deal sort of with language? I mean, let alone that soon these models will also process imagery, video, audio, like all the things. Like what makes this, I guess, cybersecurity 2.0? A completely new era that is so hard to grapple with right now. Maybe Joe, you have some insights here.
Yeah, I think that it's that it's funny, the analogy that I've used to get security leaders to appreciate it is to explain that so every prompt is like submitting new code. Like ordinarily when you interact with software, the software doesn't evolve because of your interaction. And for some people, it's just that seems like a light bulb moment where when you explain that like every interaction with the model has the potential to change the model for the next, for whatever happens next with that model. And people are like, oh yeah, that's scary. But to me, that's the fundamental shift is that nothing is static anymore. Everything is constantly changing. So you can't do a code freeze and be done.
Yeah, the other thing
Like-
I'd add is like kind of building off of what Joe was saying, the fundamental shift here in a lot of ways is that the data layer and the control layer are now the same thing, right? But you can't really separate those layers in these models. And that's, I think, one of the analogies that I think has been helpful for folks to think through this, right? You really can't protect things in the same way that you might protect a traditional software system. So yeah, there's definitely going to be a bit of a shift, right? Like we've seen some guardrails, right? Some hard-coded best practices that folks have implemented that have protected against some things, but those are usually like the lower level of sophistication type attacks. And I'd say like a lot of the ways that folks are trying to come up with more sophisticated ways to wrap these systems, right, with additional controls is, like monitoring, logging a lot more of the information that is going in and out of these systems, and try to figure out a way to appropriately use that to kind of limit some more of the interactions around this that might be malicious or, try to be taking advantage of your infrastructure, the larger set of information around it.
Yeah, one of the things that someone mentioned to me at Black Hat was that any security solution to GenAI needs to be just as alive and breathing as the underlying technology itself. And I really like that actually. So I started using that too. But I think it makes a ton of sense because we're moving so quickly, and you can't do a code freeze, Joe, and sort of rely on what you have in place. It needs to continuously evolve. And with that, Joe, we had a great dinner at Black Hat with a couple of amazing people. And one of the central questions that we discussed there, and you brought this up earlier in this conversation too, is who should ultimately own AI security? And I think that's a really interesting question. You and I have spoken about this a lot. There's sort of, maybe some of the more intuitive ones like prompt attacks and DLP, because people feel like they've kind of covered that sort of area before. But also things like content moderation that you brought up earlier. Is this going to sit with the security team long term? Is something else going to pop up? Like, how should we think about this? Who should be responsible for what we are discussing today in an organization?
Yeah, well, this question is even more complicated than it should be because we haven't fully answered where should the cybersecurity organization sit. It's such a new field itself, where like we know where the CFO sits, we know where the general counsel sits, we kind of know where marketing sits, we even know the background and experience and education that you're supposed to have for each of those jobs. But if you take 100 security executives, some of them report up to legal, some report to the CIO, some report to the board directly, a few like myself have reported to the CEO. And so then you go into the security organizations and half of them are technical and half of them are more compliance driven. But most of them have very little kind of what we would call trust and safety experience. Like a lot of organizations in technology that have large customer bases. So places I worked at like Facebook or eBay or PayPal, we had to deal with customer facing issues and security because we had to protect the customers from attacks. A lot of security leaders have only lived in the enterprise side. So just thinking about like, how do I make my email and my website safe? So this is a very challenging question. What I worry about is that too many security leaders are stepping back instead of stepping up. And when I speak to security executives, I say very clearly, you need to go take on AI responsibility for your company. You think about digital risk more than anybody, any other leader at the company. You wake up every day thinking about, how do I stop my organization from being attacked technically? And that's what we're thinking about here at a high level. And so I want to see more security leaders step up, but they have to get outside their comfort zone if they're going to go into, end user land, so to speak. And that's where some of the reticence is so far, and a lot of them will say, well, I'm not a data scientist. I've never studied models. I'm not ready, but they're also, not every one of them is an application security specialist, and they manage application security teams. So they're going to have to embrace it, and then they're going to have to hire the right specialists on their team to help them.
To add to that, I also really like this new trend I've noticed with a CAIO, which is just foul soup. But I like the idea of organizing the risk and the use of LLMs within your organization. The idea of coupling that under a single executive, I think maybe is another potential solution. I think I agree with Joe that as a security practitioner, I think it makes sense to stay in security. We're just focused on so many other aspects of keeping the business safe. So having a dedicated executive, I could see the value in that.
Yeah, I think that the security executive role is in a state of evolution right now, even if you took AI out of the conversation. There's a higher expectation of investment in cybersecurity than ever before, and governments are putting more pressure on the private sector to do more on cybersecurity, and CEOs and boards are now expecting that the security leader be capable of, sitting in the same room with them, having intellectual conversations with them. And this is just another part of the challenge of, rising to that occasion for those security leaders.
Amazing. Before we head over to the Q&A, I just saw a great comment on the Zoom chat here. We talked a lot about the evolving landscape, the dynamic risks that we are seeing, and Shai pointed out that we've got similar concerns or challenges on the regulatory side. And in fact, I can speak to that myself. So having been in Brussels many times, trying to contribute in meaningful ways to the EU AI Act and beyond. If we think about the EU AI Act as one of the exemplary regulatory pieces, this was all drafted pre-ChatGPT. It was all worked out. Suddenly, this thing hit, and the regulatory world sort of stood upside down, and then we were thinking about, well, what are we going to do here? Like, what should we do next? The technology is changing. Is this regulatory concept even applicable still? The solution that they chose was, well, we add this appendix. So we essentially ended up with an appendix that now regulates the future versus a whole book that sort of looks at the past. But that's certainly something where it's not only the organizations themselves, the enterprises themselves, it's also the regulatory world that, and beyond, to be honest, that's struggling with these dynamic risks. There was a great question in addition to that on Zoom here. And I think this is probably for you, Christina. How does the Atlas MITRE initiative sort of differ from things like OWASP or overlap with that kind of work? And what are sort of other resources that people should be looking to that are similar to what you're working on?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say the number of community collaborations around this landscape are continuing to grow, and definitely we're not at any point, right, like kind of working through, like, the problem is big enough that there's big enough landscape here of challenges that each of the collaborative efforts are kind of working on different pieces of it. And I'd say, like, some of the different ways that you can use OWASP is like to just get an introduction into this landscape, right? Like top 10 of the landscape here is a really easy way for folks to quickly come up to speed on some of the introductions to AI security topics. Atlas is kind of one level of detail down from that, right? Like kind of breaking even more of these AI security threats into kind of more of those bite-sized chunks at a slightly larger level of detail, but that's still like more of a medium layer of information, which is why the biggest thing that we've been working with the community to build out over the last year and a half or so has been kind of that incident sharing effort that I was talking about earlier, right? Like building out that more detailed, rapid, anonymized, right? Like using MITRE as that safe space in the middle as the not-for-profit in the middle of the community there, right? To collect that data, anonymize it, and then share it back out with a protected group of kind of trusted partners that can then use that to inform a lot more of that kind of actionable set of steps that they can take around this information as well. Because I think that's really the biggest need that we've seen across the community is they need more of that, actionable data on hand to be able to really start to respond and prepare for and really prioritize certain risks around this landscape. But yeah, absolutely. The OWASP community group, just recently, COSI, the kind of collaborative around secure AI was launched. And there's even some other additional kind of community resources and just databases that have been popping up around the internet as well, right? That are all starting to kind of peel back the layers of information on different aspects of this problem. So if you want to get involved, there's a lot of areas where you can jump in, depending on which parts of the problem you want to help with. So feel free to reach out, right? I think all of us are definitely trying to make progress here and are determined to collaborate. So it's kind of community, bringing the whole community up to a certain layer instead of just working on it individually.
Amazing. That's great. Another question we got here, which I think is interesting, how do these security risks apply to internally facing applications? So I guess the question is in the context of companies are building internally facing applications that sort of help organizations internally. They're also building publicly facing chatbots. So I guess, everything we discussed today, how does this apply to internally facing applications? Should people be concerned? I guess my gut it says yes. Some perspectives on that, maybe David from you to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think externally facing applications are obviously a threat. I think there you're expecting attackers to be on one avenue where they're trying to expel data or convince your bot to do bad things. I think internal chatbots are going to be a whole different can of worms. I think disgruntled employees are going to be the biggest threat vector right there. I think they have the knowledge and the understanding and the ability to look up what the system prompt is, to be able to actually exploit this underlying model to do whatever it is, be it exfil data to a third party or to just get around any RBAC techniques. So I think there's a much bigger threat there. I think people aren't expecting, usually in a perfect world, like your internal employees are just going to ask on how to handle, XYZ cases. But yeah, the idea of a disgruntled employee, I think, is something that's always been on the minds of security practitioners. It's something we analyze and take account for in risks. But now adding this chatbot in on top of it, I think just it opens up a possibility for a lot more negative impact than we're anticipating.
Yeah, there's really two sides to this particular threat when you expose something just inside the corporation. One is definitely what we call insider threat, which is, it could be a disgruntled employee, but it also could be an employee who accidentally stumbles across information. But then flip it around. The other side of this is more than 90% of compromises of enterprises involve a compromise of the identity of an employee because of the privileged access that comes with it. So, most of the major cybersecurity incidents of the last 20 years are not like some bad guy hacked through the code and somehow got to the database. They took over the identity of an employee and used the privileged access to the employee to access the sensitive information. And so the more powerful tools you give to an employee, the more powerful tools you give to someone who steals the identity of the employee. And that's fundamentally, what we see over and over in cybersecurity is that compromise an employee, go download the most sensitive things that you can find with that employee's access and then drop the ransomware.
Even kind of more than the insider threat angle of this, I think there's a component that folks might not be realizing, even though a system might be internally developed, right? Doesn't mean that all scraps of code, all scraps of data, right? Like everything that went on into that system was entirely sanitized, entirely controlled, entirely like developed internal to the organization. So even if you're not concerned about the insider threat or, malicious actors taking advantage of the access of your employees, most AI developers are not just working in a vacuum in a corner somewhere and developing everything from scratch, right? Like this is usually a very collaborative community that takes advantage of a lot of external repositories for data or code snippets or techniques. And you could be easily bringing in different pieces of vulnerabilities from external code environments when developing a system entirely in-house from scratch, but just purely by leveraging some of the different techniques and data sets that are external as well. That's where we're seeing like a lot of additional both infrastructure and vulnerabilities potentially coming into environments where folks really don't even have a mechanism to detect it, much less mitigate it.
Absolutely. It feels like we could continue talking all morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where people are. But we're sort of coming up to the full hour here. Last question from my side, David, Christina, Joe. How can people learn more about your work? So following up from this webinar, maybe it's LinkedIn, maybe it's something else. How can people learn more about what you're doing and how to protect organizations from GenAI risks?
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm on LinkedIn and publish articles there on AI and other topics. But I also have my own website, joesullivansecurity.com, which is where the name of my LLC, where I do my security consulting.
Christina.
I just dropped the atlas.miner.org link into the chat for everyone, for those of you that aren't familiar with it. There is a Slack community space around that where we have kind of more informal conversations. We also have a GitHub page where we open source all of the tools, techniques, even the website itself, for folks to be able to use inside of their own environments. If you want to get engaged, we've got a major initiative around threat emulation, mitigations, all of the incident sharing effort that I talked about earlier. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get involved to both come up to speed, understand some of these new spaces. There's an AI security 101 page, et cetera, right? Stuff for you to learn from, but also stuff for you to directly influence as we're continuing to drive progress across the larger community in AI security here as well.
Amazing. David.
Yeah, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Obviously, I'm very present there. I think the best way to get more understanding of what this landscape looks like, and specifically a lot of AI red teaming, please check out my blog. It's on Medium, and I'm at DCAM, at DCAM. Definitely find ways to reach out and ask questions as well. I've been doing this for a year and a little bit now, which in LLM years, like years, and LLM security is even longer. So it's an incredible, fun ride. On the test and evaluation side, if you're interested on continually evaluation, what that might look like, not necessarily on the security side, Scale does have an offering for test and evaluation where we test models on how well they are doing at math, at language translation, and stuff like that. So give that a look as well.
Amazing. Well, Christina, Joe, David, thank you so much for your time. All three of you are incredibly busy, but I really enjoy learning from all three of you. Definitely, very unique in the space, your perspectives, and at the forefront of where we are. So thank you for sharing that with us. One question that came up in the Q&A that we didn't answer is, how can we learn more about what Lakera is doing? We launched what we call our AI Security Hub that you can find on our website. We publish insights there from Gandalf, our research team, and beyond, and try to really provide helpful resources around how to think about AI security from an organizational perspective. So I recommend checking that out. And with that, thank you so much. You can get access to Lakera Guard, our AI application firewall. It always starts with a free trial. And you're set up in a couple of minutes to protect your applications that you're bringing to life from the threats that we discussed today. Thank you for your time. We're at the full hour. I know we didn't answer all of the questions in the Q&A, but feel free to reach out afterwards, and look forward to hosting many more of these sessions in the future. So thank you again, Christina, Joe, and David. See you soon.